Now let's take a look at Chapter 2. And in Chapter 2, we're going to look at materials cost, labor cost, and overhead cost. First of all, for materials cost, the standard example that I use in class is my desk that my computer sits on, and it's fairly easy to determine the cost of the plastic laminate and the particle board and the metal stock and the rivets and the other hardware that go into that desk. We're also going to take a look at direct labor cost in Chapter 2. And it's also pretty easy to measure direct labor cost. For instance, if 8 hours of direct labor are required to make my computer desk in the classroom, and if our direct labor wage rate, standard rate, is $20 per hour, then we're going to say $160 in direct labor in that desk to make that desk. $20 per hour times 8 hours. Now let's take a look at manufacturing overhead. For manufacturing overhead, there's a three-step process. We're just going to take a look at two of those steps in Chapter 2 in this lecture. And those two steps are, first of all, we'll compute the predetermined overhead rate, and then we will apply manufacturing overhead. So our learning objectives for this chapter are to compute the predetermined overhead rate, and also to apply overhead to particular jobs in production. Our two learning objectives for Chapter 2. So your authors tell you on page 68 some of the details and procedures for measuring direct materials cost. Keep in mind that it's fairly easy to determine direct materials cost in most manufacturing settings. And your authors also tell you on page 69 that determining or measuring direct labor cost is also fairly easy. And in the example that I gave you in class, it takes 8 hours of direct labor to make one of those desks at $20 an hour. So let's take a look at computing the predetermined overhead rate. So your authors indicate that it's fairly difficult to do this for a number of reasons. The first one they give you is that manufacturing overhead is an indirect cost. That means that it is impossible or very difficult to trace those costs to a particular product. For example, how much of the plant manager's salary goes into a particular product? Well, who knows? How much of the property taxes on the factory building go into a particular product? It is not easy to trace those types of costs into a particular product. So the way we overcome that difficulty in a manufacturing setting is to use a predetermined overhead rate on page 71. And the predetermined overhead rate is computed by dividing estimated total manufacturing overhead cost by estimated total amount of the allocation base. And that denominator, the allocation base, is a measure of volume. It could be number of units produced. It could be direct labor hours. That denominator could be direct labor costs that we use to apply factory overhead. So in the example on page 72, your estimated total manufacturing overhead cost for the year are $320,000, and your estimated direct labor hours, which is going to be your allocation base, are 40,000 direct labor hours for the year. Why don't you pause the video and see if you can't compute the overhead rate. And on that same page, right below that, in your textbook, they compute the overhead rate of $8 per direct labor hour. So if there's 8 direct labor hours in that desk, then we're going to say 8 direct labor hours times $8 per direct labor hour, we're going to say $64 in manufacturing overhead in that desk. So we can't directly associate overhead cost with production like we can materials cost and direct labor cost. So this is our indirect way of allocating overhead to production. That's step one. Step two is we apply or allocate overhead to a particular job by multiplying that overhead rate times the actual amount of activity used to complete that job. So if it takes 10 hours of direct labor, we're going to allocate $80 in overhead. If it takes 4 hours of direct labor, we will allocate $32 in overhead to a particular job. So on page 88, your author summarized the 3 steps. We're only going to look at 2 of them. And those 2 steps are, number 1, we compute the predetermined overhead rate by dividing estimated total manufacturing overhead cost by the estimated amount of the allocation base, the estimated amount of the volume. And step number 2, we apply factory overhead to production by multiplying the overhead rate times the actual amount of the allocation base, the actual amount of volume. So let's take a look at this little problem. A company estimates the following amounts for the year. Estimated overhead cost is $381,600 and estimated direct labor cost is $318,000, and the company uses direct labor to allocate overhead. So why don't you compute the predetermined overhead rate? Okay, let's take a look together right there. For the predetermined overhead rate, I'm going to say estimated overhead cost divided by estimated volume or estimated activity, which is direct labor cost. So my overhead rate is going to be 120% of direct labor cost. Let me check and see if there are any decimals hiding out there. Nope. So my predetermined overhead rate is 120% of direct labor cost. Now the job cost sheet for job 413 shows materials of $12,000 and direct labor of $8,000. You are to determine, number 1, the amount of overhead allocated to job number 413. Number 2, you are to determine the total manufacturing cost assigned to job 413. And number 3, if a total of 200 units were produced in job 413, what was the unit production cost? What was the cost of each of those 200 units? So why don't you pause the video and take a few minutes and see if you can't answer those 3 questions. Okay, now let's take a look together. I'm first going to compute the overhead allocated to job number 413 right there, and overhead is allocated at 120% of direct labor cost. So I'm going to say 8,000 direct labor cost times 120%. And the overhead allocated to job number 413 is $9,600. So number 2, the total manufacturing cost is just the sum of materials, direct labor, and overhead. So there's the total manufacturing cost assigned to job 413 And number 3, if 200 units are produced in job 413, the cost per unit is going to be, let me put a $sign right there and get rid of those decimals. The cost per unit is going to be $29,600 total cost, materials, labor, and overhead assigned to job 413, divided by the number of units produced in that job. And I'm going to have $148 as the cost of each unit produced in job 413. There's the answer to number 3. Now you've just completed exercise 2-10, and exercise 2-10 looks like this. Notice they've already computed the overhead rate for you there, which is 120%. And there's 8,000 in direct labor cost right there, 12,000 in materials cost, and a total of 200 units produced. So we computed the total manufacturing cost assigned to job 413 right there. And we also computed the unit product cost for job 413. So be prepared for a quiz at the beginning of class on Wednesday based on the content of this video lecture. You might want to review it one more time just to be certain that you're prepared.